Everyone is talking about the next recession, but why nobody is talking about the real crisis that we're about to face? And I'm not talking about just a crisis where some people are going to lose their jobs, but a crisis that is going to be as big as the crisis of 1929, as the depression of 1929. And this is not like my opinion or someone else's opinion out here. This is pure math, and I will show you the math exactly, and you will see what a real crisis is coming. And the point isn't to scare you off, but rather just to explain to you. Because if you can mathematically predict the next crisis, then you can actually prepare yourself and take advantage out of it. Just like Michael Burry did back in 2008. He knew that a crisis is coming, and he made hundreds of millions of dollars. So pay attention. Now, if you take a look at the US national debt at this point, you will find out that it's a little over $35 trillion. Maybe by the time I'm done recording this video, it might actually be like $36 trillion. And while a lot of people talk that we have to pay the debt because the debt is getting out of control, there are people on the other side who are actually claiming that it's not really a big deal because the United States can sustain its debt. And for us to understand the next crisis, the real crisis that's coming, we have to understand how the US debt actually works because it is going to play a major role in that. So if you take a look at the US debt at this point, you'll realize that it can be divided into two categories. We have public debt and then we have intragovernmental debt. And the difference between them is very simple. Like it's not really some complicated difference out there. When we talk about intergovernmental debt, then that is the debt that the United States owes to other funds or the corporations that belong to the US government. For example, the retirement fund and different kind of funds that we actually have. But this is like a tiny portion because as of 2024, when I'm recording this video, it's about $7 trillion. And the rest of it, which means that around $28 to $29 trillion are public debt. And public debt is the debt that the United States borrowed from you, from me, from other governments, from the Federal Reserve, which means that it's a real debt. Like if it's a government borrowing from itself, then maybe the government can do something about it and not worry about it. But if the government borrowed the money from you when you actually bought a government bond, then if the government does not return that money back to you, the government is going to be in trouble. And if you take a look at the countries that the United States at this point actually owes money to, at the top of the list we have Japan, China, the UK, other European countries, but that's not really the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that most of that debt is actually held by the average people, by people like you and me, just like I told you right now. And the important thing you have to answer and understand here is that, like the question that a lot of people don't really get, why the government is actually borrowing so much money in the first place? That's a very good question, right? Now, if you think about the US government or the United States overall, and if you put the United States at the historical context, you will find out that United States is the wealthiest country the world has ever seen. I mean, if you check the human civilization since its inception up until today, you'll find out that there hasn't been such a wealthy country in the entire history of humanity as wealthy as the United States. And yet, this wealthy country, for some reason, is borrowing so much money in the first place. Why is the US government borrowing so much money? And the answer to that is very simple and straightforward. I know that it might actually sound complicated because a lot of people are actually saying that, no, it's not that the US government borrowing money. It's just the United States is simply printing money out of thin air. Now, when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I used to believe that. But as I got deeper into this thing, I realized that the United States is not really printing money out of thin air. That's a delusion that a lot of people who don't understand how things work are actually spreading. You see, the United States is so big that it can borrow so much money. To some people, it might seem like the United States is actually borrowing money. For example, the Greece GDP, which is a tiny country in European Union with a GDP of $200 billion, maximum that it can probably borrow is $200, maybe $300 billion. But the United States has a GDP of like 28 or at this point, it's probably like $25 trillion. So when you have a GDP of $25 trillion, you can borrow significantly more money. And to a lot of people who can't comprehend these numbers, it seems like the United States is actually creating money out of thin air. Now, think about yourself. Let's say you are making $100,000 at this point. How much money do you think you can borrow? Maybe you can get a credit card that you can max out to $20,000. Maybe you can get a mortgage up to $500,000. Maybe you can get a car loan up to $70,000. There is a limit to how much money you can actually borrow. But let's say, for example, that hypothetically, Donald Trump is going to go and borrow money. I mean, he's significantly wealthier than you, right? And let's be honest, he can borrow more money than you can. He probably can borrow hundreds of millions of dollars. Now let's go one step above that and assume that Elon Musk is going to borrow money. He can borrow significantly more money than Donald Trump can at this point, because he's like 10 times or 100 times wealthier than Donald Trump. And that's the exact same thing. The US economy is so huge, the US GDP is so big that to some people, it seems like the United States is actually creating money out of thin air, when in reality, the United States is simply borrowing because it can borrow that much money because of the size of its economy. So in order to understand why the United States is actually borrowing money, you have to understand why you would borrow money. Like, you have income and then you have expenses, right? Let's say, for example, you're making $10,000 per month and you can spend $10,000 per month. If for some reason you want to spend $12,000 every single month, but you're just making $10,000, what you can do is that you can use your credit card and spend an extra $2,000. So the only reason you're spending more money than you're earning is because you are borrowing money to spend that money. The only reason you're borrowing money is because you are not making as much money as you actually want, as much money as you want to actually spend in the first place. And that's the basic logic. And if you keep spending more money than you actually make, then you will have to keep borrowing money. That's the exact same logic with the United States. And because of the size of the US economy, the United States can borrow more money than you can possibly imagine. So let's take a look at the US budget. Let's take a look at how much money the United States is actually making and how much money the United States is actually spending, and take a look what's happening there. That will give us a far better image. So this is the spending of the US government for 2023, as you can see right here. And the United States spent $6.13 trillion in 2023. That's a lot of money. That's more money than any government has ever spent. But that's not really a big deal. I mean, if you're making $1 million and you're spending $1 million, like, who cares? You are earning that money in the first place. So let's take a look at how much money the United States is actually making. So in 2023, the United States made $4.4 trillion. Wait a second. The US made $4.4 trillion and yet it spent over $6 trillion. What exactly is happening here? The rest of the money, where did it come from? Exactly. That is the money that the US government borrowed, and that is $1.7 trillion, as you can see there. And that's what we call a deficit, when you spend more money than you're actually earning. And how exactly did the US government borrow that money? The United States creates a piece of paper or a piece of document that we call an IOU, or a government bond. And that government bond or piece of paper or document says that the United States owes an X amount of money plus interest to whoever owns this piece of document. So if you go right now to the market and you buy a government bond, you're essentially giving, let's say, $1,000 to the government, and then the government will have to pay you back that $1,000, let's say 10 years from now, and plus it will pay you 5% interest if the interest rates are 5% at that particular moment, period. So the United States can simply issue these bonds as much as it wants, as long as it can sustain them. That's basically how any government across the globe today actually borrows money. And that's what we call actually a government bond. But that actually leads us to a very interesting idea over here, is that, well, 2023 was maybe a tough year. Maybe the United States had to borrow $1.7 trillion because things weren't really easy. We had a crisis in Europe. We just got out of the pandemic. We have another crisis over here. So it's normal, right? For example, if you're actually living your life, you're making money, you're spending money. It's absolutely normal. When you have a crisis in your life, you are going to go and use your credit card to pay for some of your expenses. And once you're getting out of the crisis, let's say you got sick and you got medical bills. Once you are recovered, you get out of the hospital, you go and work hard, and then you pay off your debt. That's why debt is great. Debt isn't really bad. Debt isn't really something that you should be scared of. Because if you're in the hospital, you have two options. Let's say, for example, you're going to pass away or you're going to incur some debt. I would rather get some debt, get out of the hospital, work my ass off, and then pay off my debt. Otherwise, I'm going to just pass away, and that will be the end of the game, right? It's the same thing with the countries. So it's absolutely normal that the United States had like a deficit of $1.7 trillion in 2023. But if you kind of zoom out and take a look at the spending of the US government over the last 20 or 30 years, you will be amazed because things are not really as gloomy as they may actually be. So this is the graph that illustrates US government spending for the last since the year 2000. And as you can see, right, every single year since the year 2000, the US government has been running a deficit. Yes, sometimes it was high, sometimes it was low, but overall, over the entire period of the last 25 years, the United States, not 25 years, probably like 23 years it's gonna be, for the last 23 years, the United States has been spending more money than it's earning. And all those extra dollars were coming out of debt. And that is why the national debt in the United States today is around what, 25, no, what, it's not 25, it's $36 trillion, give and take, something like that. And the biggest problem is that, see, a lot of people say that the United States can service its debt. So what is the big deal? Let me explain to you what is the big deal here. See, if you keep getting debts, at some point your debt, every single debt has an interest. You can't just borrow money with zero interest. It doesn't work like that. So every single debt has an interest on it. And when the debt grows so big, even that interest is going to incur so much expenses that you no longer can actually sustain it. So for example, let's say you have 5% interest on a debt of $100,000. That's $5,000 annually. That's not really a big deal. You can actually sustain that. But now let's say for a moment that you have a 5% interest on a loan that is $1 million. Suddenly it's $50,000, right? So if you kind of stop paying your debts, especially if you kind of stop decreasing your debt by itself is going to keep growing whether you want that or not, just because the debt has grown so big. And that actually leads us to an entirely different question. That actually leads us to an entirely different problem that a lot of people are actually not paying attention to. This is the total debt that the United States has probably at the beginning of 2024. So this number might be significantly higher by the time you are going to watch this video. How much interest do you think the United States paid in 2023 alone just to service its debt? That is $875 billion. Just stop for a moment and think about that. Just think about that for a moment. The United States paid almost $1 trillion just to service its debt last year. And the total amount of money that the US government made last year, 2023, was a little over $4 trillion. So imagine you are making $100,000 and $25,000 of that money is going to go to pay the interest on your debt. You're not paying off your debt. Yes, a small fraction of that money is going to pay off your debt, but the vast majority of that money is going to pay just the interest. And of course, as I've explained to you previously, that we have intragovernmental debt and then we have the public debt. So out of this $875 billion, almost $500 billion of that money is just to pay the interest on the public debt. So this is the money that we can't really avoid, no matter we want that or not, no matter whether the US government want that or not. This debt must be paid because this is the debt on the public This is the interest on the public debt. Now, I want you to think about that number for a moment, because one of the largest, this is probably the largest or the second largest expense for the US government, is the military. So the US military runs the largest budget in the world. The US military is the largest military in the history of humanity. The US military spends more money on itself than the next top 10 countries combined. That is how big the United States military is. In fact, what makes the United States such a great country in the first place is because it has built the most powerful military humanity has ever seen. And that's why it spends astronomical amounts of money. Like if you take the adversaries of the United States, they don't even spend half of the United States. The second country that spends probably close to United States is China, that spends around $200 billion. And China's economy is almost as big as the US economy. So this number that you can see here is astronomical. And yet the United States at this point has to pay more to service its debt than to actually maintain the world's largest military that has ever been on the face of the earth. Do you see how problematic the debt crisis has become at this point? But that's just part of the problem, because the main question that we want to answer here is that, can the United States pay its debts? That's a good question, right? I mean, yes, we have a problem. We have $36 trillion of debt, but can we mathematically pay off this debt? Because if you can actually pay off this debt, let's come up with a plan and then stick to that plan. And in a matter of some time, we are going to get out of debt. Like, for example, if you have massive debts, let's say you have $100,000 worth of debt. What are you going to do? Then you have to restructure your expenses, your income, where the vast majority of your income is going to go towards paying off your debt. And in a few months, or probably in a few years, you will get out of your situation and you will pay off your debt. It's as simple as that, right? If you have $100,000 debt and then it has a 15% interest rate, for example, and you're making $10,000 per month, if you spend 50% of your income every single month to pay off your debt, at some point, I mean, if we do the math, within a few months or a couple of years, you'll get out of debt, right? And that's exactly what the United States has to do. So the question that we want to ask ourselves at this point is that, can the United States do something like that in the first place? Like, can the United States mathematically restructure its expenses and its income in such a way that it will be able to pay off its debt? Let's take a look at that. So for 2023, the United States spent over $6 trillion and it had a revenue of $4.4 trillion and a deficit of $1.7 trillion. A deficit is the money that the United States borrowed in order to sustain its spending in the first place. So for the United States, I'm not now talking about paying off its debt. The first step is not paying off your debt. The first step is stop borrowing money, right? For example, if you're living on a credit card, you can never pay off your debt if you still continue living on your credit card. So for the United States, you can just use that methodology for you to understand it easier. For the United States to get out of debt in the first place is that it should stop. It should either cut its spending to such a level where it will just spend as much money as it's making, or the United States should make more money in order to balance with its spending. That's very logical, right? So let's take a look at what the United States spent most of its money last year. So out of the a little over $6 trillion, the biggest expense that the United States has incurred was the Social Security. So the United States spends $1.3 trillion on Social Security. And what is that exactly? Most importantly, that's retirement, disabilities. I mean, retirements are the most important thing. So now ask yourself a very simple question. Can the United States at this point cut Social Security? No, that's impossible. Now imagine people have spent decades working, paying taxes so that they can have a comfortable retirement, so that they won't. I'm not talking about comfortable retirement. I'm talking about people just having enough money to survive. And now you're going to tell them, listen, guys, I know that you've been paying taxes. I know that you've worked for 20, 30, 50 years, but it's game over. We can't really pay you. There are going to be riots in the streets tomorrow. That's not something that the United States can afford at this point. So forget about that. United States simply cannot touch Social Security at all. This is like sacred. But let's take a look at the second largest expense of the United States. And you can see that it's national defense. And the total amount that the US actually spends is a little over $1 trillion. Wait a second, wasn't defense $828 billion? Yes, of course. But remember, whenever you send people to war, whenever they go and fight wherever in the world, they will come back at some point. And they will come back. They don't start businesses. They don't come back with millions of dollars in savings. They don't come back entrepreneurs all the time. Sometimes that happens, but that's very rare. So these people needs to be taken care of. And that's why we call these people veterans. And these people must be paid a living amount of money in order for them to survive in the world, right? And we spend $298 billion, almost $300 billion. So imagine for a moment if the United States tomorrow cuts that spending, and we're going to tell, the US government is going to tell people is that, listen guys, veterans are no longer going to get paid. What do you think is going to happen? Would you really join the military knowing that when you get out of the military and you will come back home, nobody is going to take care of you? Of course, nobody is going to join the military. Well, can the United States at least kind of reduce the size of its military? Well, absolutely it can. Of course, that's an option right in front of the US government. But the problem is that now is the time where the United States is facing the biggest geopolitical challenges that it has ever faced. You have a crisis in Europe. You have China that is about to take over Taiwan. And then we have all of these countries that are spreading their geopolitical interests across the globe. So if at this point, when China is raising its military budget, the United States stops reducing its military budget, that means that the United States is going down right in front of the entire world. So that's not something that the United States can actually afford. And I don't think the US will ever do something like that in the foreseeable future. But let's take a look at the next thing that the United States is spending money on: Medicare. And what is Medicare? Spending $850 billion on Medicare. Is it something that the United States can cut off? Absolutely not, because without Medicare, people will not make it out of the hospitals. In fact, they will not make it to the hospitals because most people rely on Medicare in order to survive. Medicare is one of those essentials in everyday lives of the most Americans. Maybe, of course, the top 10% might not need it, maybe the top 5% because they have enough money to pay for all of their medical bills. But the vast majority of people actually rely on Medicare. So any politicians who will come and will claim that he will get rid of the entire Medicare, what do you think is going to happen? He will never be elected. They will tell the government is that, listen guys, you want to cut spending? Here is the defense. We don't want to go to war. Please cut the defense budget, not the Medicare, because you are going to destroy us. There are going to be riots in the streets as well if the United States will ever touch Medicare. I mean, maybe it can be restructured in such a way and the United States can reduce that number by 100 or $150 billion. But that's pretty much what the United States can do with that. The next expense is assistance to individuals. That's almost $500 billion. Again, that's not something the United States can actually touch because it's one of the essential things that actually keeps the United States kind of together. You can call it like that if you want. And the next expense, of course, is net interest on the debt. And that amount is almost $650 billion. That's a lot of money. I mean, this is not the debt that the government is paying. This is just the interest that the government is paying to sustain the debt it actually has. Can the United States tomorrow say that, oh, we are not going to pay the interest? We're not paying the debt at this point. I mean, we're paying, a portion of that debt, a very small amount. But if the United States tomorrow is not going to pay the total interest that it needs to make every single month or every single quarter or every single year on its debt, it is going to destroy the US economy. So the United States shouldn't cut this number, but the United States should raise this number to at least $1 trillion, probably more than that, in order to get out of debt crisis. So that's not something that the United States can even touch. The next major expense, of course, transfers to the states. That is, of course, an important spending for the US government. That's almost around $1 trillion. In order to maintain a country, you need roads, you need infrastructure, you need bridges, you need schools. I mean, how are you supposed to manage a country where you can't even have schools, where people can't really get the basic education? So all of these schools, all of these roads are because, people are paying taxes for them to have roads. People have paying taxes so that there will be schools where they will send their kids to. Of course, the top 1% or the top 10% can actually afford private schools. But the vast majority of the population cannot afford anything like that. That's why they have to send their kids to public schools. So that's not something the United States can even touch. And the next major spending, of course, everything else. We have public health, banking and finance, transportation and others. So if you kind of zoom out and take a look, there is nothing that the United States at this point can touch. There is absolutely nothing that the United States can do in order to reduce its spending. It's not an option. The only option is, of course, the defense right here. But if the United States is going to do anything like that, then that will literally just change the global order that the United States shaped after World War II. So if the United States cannot cut spending, let's take a look if the United States can actually increase its revenue, increase its income. Maybe that's a possibility. Let's be very optimistic, right? So let's take a look where the money is coming out that is filling the US budget. In 2023, the United States earned $4.5 trillion. That's a lot of money, even though that it's significantly lower than the $6 trillion. Still, $4.5 trillion is a lot of money. And the largest contributors to this $4.5 trillion were the individual income taxes, where they actually made up almost $2.2 trillion. And this is the taxes that you pay. This is the taxes that lawyers pay, engineers, software engineers, the construction workers. So the average people who are working 9 to 5 every single year, these are the people who are making the largest contribution to the US government. These are the people who are actually holding the government because they're paying most of the taxes. And some of these people who are making like a few $100,000, maybe $500,000 or more than that, they are paying probably over half of their income to taxes. But guess what? That's not all. That's just a part of it. Because the second largest source of revenue for the government is payroll taxes, and it makes up $1.6 trillion. Now, take a moment and guess, what exactly is a payroll tax? A payroll tax is a tax that your employer pays. So, at first glance, it seems like corporations are paying that tax, right? But payroll tax is the tax that goes to your social security, that actually going to fund your retirement later on. So wait a second. So your employer, instead of paying you, for example, $100,000, it is going to pay you $90,000 so that the other $10,000 is going to go to your retirement, which means that your employer is paying payroll tax on behalf of you by cutting a portion of your salary in the first place. So who do you think at the end of the day is actually paying the payroll tax? You. The average working person is paying that tax. So if you actually take these two parts, you will realize that that's almost like $3.8 trillion. $3.8 trillion out of the $4.5 trillion is paid by the people who are working average jobs like construction, engineers, lawyers, doctors. Do you think that's fair? It sounds very unfair. I think the only question that a lot of people at this point have is that, where is the corporate tax? How much corporations are paying? And that is the next biggest source of income for all of this, for the government. Because corporations are paying $419 billion. At least that's how much they paid actually last year. Wait a second. Why corporations are paying so little compared to the individual taxes that everyone else is paying? Think about that for a moment. Apple, Amazon, Tesla, Nvidia, Walmart, think about any company that you can actually think about. Companies that worth trillions of dollars, companies that make hundreds of billions of dollars. If you take their combined contribution to the US government, it's not even $500 billion. It's literally just a fraction of what everyone else is paying. So if you think that when they are talking about raising taxes, they never talk about raising taxes on corporations. They always talk about raising taxes on you. They always talk about raising taxes on the average working person. But let's not talk about that for a moment. Let's talk about the other sources of income for the US government. And you will see that we have small sources such as sales tax. They don't really make up a huge portion of the income, and even raising them and increasing them is not really a possibility. But the biggest source of income for 2023 for the US government has, of course, been debt. The US government raised $1.7 trillion of debt in order to sustain its spending. So I want to ask you a simple question right now. Who do you think, if the US government tomorrow decides that it wants to increase its revenue, how do you think it's going to do that? Do you think they will raise taxes on corporations? Now, let's be very optimistic. Let's say that the US government is going to start by raising taxes on corporations. Is that a possibility? Yes, let's be optimistic. Let's not just bury the US government. The corporate tax, as of the time I'm recording this video, is 21% in the United States. If the United States is going to raise the corporate tax, the highest that can raise it to is probably like 35, 37%. It's not going to raise it more than that. So if the United States is going to raise it that much, guess what? All these corporations, as usual, are going to lobby in order to have this loopholes within the tax code in order for them to avoid the taxes. So if right now they're paying $420 billion, maximum that they can actually pay extra is probably another $150 billion, maybe slightly more than that, maybe $200 billion. So instead of paying $419 billion, that money is going to be raised to $600 billion or maybe $650 billion. Is it a lot of money? Absolutely. But would it really make any kind of a real difference? Of course not. So the only way for the US government to actually increase its revenue to balance the budget is, again, raise taxes on you. I know that it doesn't really sound optimistic, but this is the only option the United States government actually has at this point in order to avoid any kind of debt crisis in the foreseeable future. Will the United States do that? No, think about that for a moment. Think about that we have an election and we have a candidate that will say that when I will get elected, I will raise the taxes to pay off the debt. I bet that he will never ever win an election, because even if somebody who is going to raise taxes is going to win the election and will be elected to the Oval Office, what's going to happen next? There will always be someone else who is going to promise to lower the taxes, and by the next term, he will be elected, and the person who actually raised the taxes will lose his job and will be unemployed and will be a former president. And that's the biggest problem we have at this point. The United States doesn't really have much options to solve this crisis in the first place. So even if we manage to somehow close the deficit, the debt will keep growing. And that's the problem. Let's just say hypothetically that the US government raised taxes, or for example, it cut spending to the point where it's actually spending as much as it's earning. Just like in this case, we don't have this debt. Now we have balanced the budget. What is going to happen? Are we out of this crisis? Absolutely not. Because we have a $36 trillion debt, and that debt has interest, so it is not going to be solved, whether we want that or not. In order for the US government to solve that crisis, it has to make significantly more than it's actually spending, so that all that surplus, all that extra money is going to go towards paying the debt in the first place. So in a matter of 10 to 15 years, the United States is going to solve the debt problem. So even if the United States somehow manages to raise taxes and make an extra $1.7 trillion, which is, let's be honest, impossible, it's still not going to solve that problem. The United States, within the next 2 to 3 years, has to increase its income to at least $7 trillion or probably $7.5 trillion to get this problem, to solve this problem. Do you think that the United States can almost increase its revenue by 70% within the next 2 to 3 years? Well, I don't think so. And that's why if you kind of take a look at the forecast that experts have made about the US government debt for the foreseeable future, so this is 2024, which is where the debt is $35.4 trillion. According to experts, it is going to rise by 2029 to $46.7 trillion. And the problem is that when it raises to $46 trillion, and if you take a look at the expectations where the GDP is going to grow as well, the debt to GDP ratio at that point is going to be 136%. That is a lot. That is pretty much as much as Greece had back when it was experiencing its crisis. Of course, it got out of control, and its debt to GDP ratio of Greece back in 2012 and 2013 went out of control to almost 180 or 190. But this is going to put the United States at a spot where it won't be able to pay off its debt, where it has literally no chance unless to take drastic measures to cut spending. If a country like Greece, for example, can actually cut spending, Greece doesn't maintain the world's largest military in the world. Greece doesn't spend almost $1 trillion on the military, right? So a country like Greece can easily cut its spending to the point and literally maintain its debt. But a country like the United States, if the United States tomorrow cut its spending, then the United States will lose its global hegemony. The United States is going to lose its status as the superpower in the world, and that will change the world order that the United States has built. It's as simple as that, and that's why by 2029, United States will be at the point of no return, where it will never be able to pay off its debt unless it will sacrifice its status as the only superpower in the world, as the dominant power that controls the world. That's basically what the United States is actually doing. And that is the biggest problem that the United States is facing at this point. Now, nobody is talking about that. Everybody is blind about that. Everybody is acting as if we don't have this problem, but this problem actually exists. And the thing that you have to also include, or a factor that's not included in the graph that you see right in front of you, is that this is the debt of the United States growing, considering the fact that there is not going to be another crisis, there is not going to be another pandemic, there is not going to be another war that is going to disrupt the United States and will force the United States to print more money, get more debt. So that is the best case scenario. So if something like a crisis happens in the foreseeable future, in the next 5 years, let's say another war, let's say, for example, a hypothetical war in Southeast Asia, something dramatically could actually change at that point. So we are not going to include that factor, and we will assume that the US debt is going to grow at this point. But even at this point, by 2029, you can say that the United States will reach a point where it will be impossible for it to actually pay off its debt. Now ask yourself a very simple question, or maybe you have actually asked yourself this question. How exactly the United States is maintaining so much debt in the first place? And the answer to that is very simple, but it's very funny in the first place, because, I mean, you can actually do that on your own. So the United States at this point, in order to maintain so much debt, is that it creates new debt in order to pay off its old debt, because it can't really afford its old debt in the first place. Now, think about that like that. Imagine you have a credit card and you max out your credit card to $100,000, for example. And now it's the end of the month and then you have to make your payment. But you can't, you don't have the money. What do? You go to the second bank, you borrow money from the second bank in order to pay the first bank. And now you have some time. Did you solve the problem? Absolutely not. But do you have more time to solve the problem? Yes, you have actually raised the debt slightly, but now you have time to cut spending, work harder, pay off your debt. But what if you don't do anything and you keep spending money? Exactly. By the end of the next month, the second bank is going to ask you to pay off your debt. And what you can do here is that you can go to the third bank, borrow money from the third bank in order to pay the second bank, and so on and so forth. And that's exactly what the US government has been doing for the last 20 years, you can say so. Every time it has to make its debt payments, instead of actually cutting spending or raising taxes, what it's doing is that it's creating new government bonds, it's raising new debt in order to pay its old debts. And that's how the cycle is actually going on. But again, you have to understand that you cannot do this endlessly. Mathematically, there is a point where people understand that, wait a second, you literally don't have money to pay back your debt. You cannot do that. Even if you want it, even if you cut your spending, even if you raise taxes, you literally have no way out of it. And that's where the real problem actually kicks in. But now I want to ask you there's a question that a lot of you have been probably wondering throughout this video, is that how did we end up here? Like, what exactly did we do that we ended up in such a big trouble that we are right now at this point, right? What exactly did we do wrong? And that's a very good question to ask yourself. And if you think about it, the answer is very simple. It's extremely simple, because the next graph actually illustrates the entire problem. Now, if you take a look at since 1970s, that has never been a problem. Yes, by 1990s, it started slightly rising, but it has never been like a real problem. It has been a problem, but it was manageable to a certain extent, but nobody cared, right? That doesn't look like no, but let's call it like that. Nobody really cares about that at some point. But what exactly happened at this point is that we got a war in Middle East. And when we got a war in Middle East, wars are not cheap. The government had to spend hundreds of billions of dollars for that, but that war was very quick and it wasn't really a big deal. And the United States simply actually finished that war very quickly. Especially in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States did not have an adversary, and the United States was feeling the only king in the world. It was the only superpower. It was the country that could do anything anywhere across the globe, and nobody could say anything to the United States, because our main adversary just collapsed into 15 different countries, and here we are having all the money in the world, the largest economy, the largest military. So, who can actually stop us from doing anything like that? So the US actually borrowed so much money and started that war, which was the first trigger. But that was just the beginning. Of course, after that, the debt wasn't really growing that fast for the next, you can say that for the next 10 years. And it was sustainable to a certain extent. Nobody really cared. Yes, we have some debt, but it's very, very sustainable. But you can see that at this point, something fundamentally different happened. Again, we had another war. And this is the war in Middle East, where the United States spent over $3 trillion according to some estimates. Now, a lot of estimates put the Iraq war something between like $1.5 trillion to $5 trillion. So if we take something average, which is around $3 trillion, the US literally spent $3 trillion. And guess where the money is coming from? Exactly. The United States literally borrowed trillions of dollars, or you can say at least hundreds of billions of dollars, in order to wage that war. And if you go back and take a look at the graph that shows the deficit in the US budget, you will clearly see that starting, where exactly that graph? Yeah, this is the graph. You can clearly see that at this point where the war started, the deficit started kicking in and the US government started borrowing money in order to maintain that war in the first place. So it's not really a coincidence. It's not really like rocket science to understand that the US borrowed money to start the Iraq war. And the biggest problem is that you might actually ask yourself a very simple question. Why did the government borrow that much money in order to start that war? Because if the government actually taxed you, increased taxes on you in order to pay for the war in Iraq, would you actually do it? Would you really go and work super hard in order to pay more taxes so that some politician wages a war in Middle East? That's nonsense, right? And then besides the war in Iraq, the United States actually invaded Afghanistan, which is another war. And according to some estimates, the US spends like around $1 trillion on that war over there. So here you go, like at least $4 trillion. But that was just the beginning, because while the United States was actually playing its geopolitical games across the globe, a crisis was kicking in its house. And that's what we call the crisis of the 2008. As you can see that in 2008, suddenly the United States finds itself that it's actually facing the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. And the US is like, wait a second, we borrowed what? Trillions of dollars to play our games globally? But now we have a problem inside our house. Of course, we're going to borrow trillions of dollars to get out of this crisis. So the United States borrows trillions of dollars and gets the United States out of this crisis, and then the rest of the world catches up and gets out of this crisis. Because this crisis did not just hit the United States, it hit the entire world. But that's the point when the United States understands that it can actually borrow, it can solve any crisis by printing money, by borrowing money. And logically, you might actually think about it this way. We had a crisis, we borrowed money, and now the crisis is over by 2010. Maybe we should kind of cut our spending and save more money to pay off our debts. No, that's not what the US does. What the United States does after that is it's like, we can keep borrowing money. And that's why if you kind of pay attention, the US, this is the period of peace and prosperity. This is the period of economic growth. This is the period when the United States should save money in order to pay off its debt. But instead, the United States keeps borrowing money at this point, at this period, and keeps expanding that debt instead of actually paying off this debt at this point. And then 2022 kicks in, and we have a global pandemic where the United States had to print a few $1 trillion in order to get the country out of this pandemic. And that's where the situation goes significantly worse. So if you're actually wondering what exactly has happened, this is what exactly has happened. Since 1990 to 2022, the United States literally borrowed trillions of dollars, I would say dozens of trillions of dollars, to solve everything, not just solve its internal crises without actually raising taxes, but actually play its geopolitical games. And this is very sad because this is the period where the United States had its best period in its entire history. Like 100 years from now, when people are going to open the history textbooks and will read about the global history or the history of the United States, they will read about a history that from 1990 to 2022 was the golden period of the United States. This was the period where the US empire was at its peak, where the United States could do anything. And instead of actually taking the United States to a completely different level, what the US politicians did is that they simply borrowed, unbelievable amounts of money to play some geopolitical games across the globe. And that's why, if you're wondering how exactly we got here, here is your answer. It's as simple as that. We actually, now the next generation is going to pay the price for these mistakes. The next generation will actually do that. But now let's be a bit optimistic and talk about the solutions that we have, because it's still not too late. We still got time, right? So how exactly, if we wanted to solve this crisis today, how exactly can we solve this crisis? Like, what exactly can we do right now, today, in order to solve this crisis? The answer to that is very simple. The first and obvious solution is, of course, raise taxes, cut spending. If you're full of debt, how do you solve the problem? You cut your spending, and you try to make as much money as possible in order to pay off your debts. It's as simple as that. If you can do that within a period of time, you will get out of debt. But that is not happening in the foreseeable future, at least in the next probably 10 years. Why? Because if anybody will promise anything like that, he will never see even the door of the Oval Office. And that's why no politicians will do that. But we have a second solution, and that's the solution that probably the United States is betting on, and that is to let the economy grow faster. The GDP for the last 25 years has been growing by 2%, maybe 2.5% at best. Best case scenario, 2.8%. But if the US GDP grows by 4% over the next 20 years, then the United States GDP is going to grow significantly faster, or not significantly faster, but at least slightly faster than the debt. And that means that the United States can maintain its debt and slowly pay it off over time. But that's not happening at all, because it happened back after World War II. But after World War II, the geopolitical situation was very different. The United States was the most powerful country in the world. Europe was destroyed after World War II. China was 50 million people died of famine. Soviet Union was barely it lost a quite chunk of its population at its industrial part. And then the rest of the world literally relied on the United States. And that's how the United States could actually maintain high GDP growth. Is that the case today? Absolutely not. China is a powerful country. Europe has its own we have Russia, then we have Germany, we have the United Kingdom, and then we have literally the rest of the world that already caught up. So how the United States will pull off something like that, I don't really know. I'm not really hinting at anything, but something could actually happen. Maybe that's why we have so much tensions actually around Taiwan and the war with China. Anyways, let's not talk about that. The third solution that the United States has is 3, 4, maybe 5 years from now, the people will realize that, maybe even more than that, maybe 7 years from now, where people or the world will realize that the US government bonds are no longer as sustainable as they have been the last 50 years or since World War II. Because mathematically, the United States cannot pay off its debts even if it wanted to cut its spending, even if it wanted to raise taxes. And they will see that there are actually really good alternatives, like, for example, investing elsewhere. And that's the moment where the rating agencies are going to downgrade the US government bonds. And that actually creates a fundamental problem for the US government, because you see, the higher you rate with the rating agencies, the less you can actually the less you can actually offer for your bonds. So for example, the US government is the most stable government in the world, and the US simply can sell off its government bonds just offering 2%. But if it's Venezuela, for example, that is very unstable and we don't know how long it's going to last, they cannot kind of offer you 2% because nobody is going to buy its government bonds. So they have to offer like 15% because they're so unstable since risks are high. So when the risks with the US government bonds are going to rise, the United States will actually need to offer higher interest rate, which means that maintaining that debt will become even more problematic in the first place, and that will pose a much bigger problem. And that will leave the United States with two options. Option number one, keep doing what you're doing, and that will create massive inflation in the United States, and that will just destroy the system. That's not something the United States want to do. So I think the United States will take the second option, and that option is actually go back to step number one, or option number one. Raise taxes, cut spending. That's when the United States will restructure its military. That's when the United States will restructure Medicare, Social Security, whatever. And those restructures will actually lead to cutting a lot of spending, and that's how the United States will actually make it. But that means that the United States is no longer going to have the advantage that it had the last 30 years. That means that the United States is not going to grow like it used to grow the last 30 years. So the building wealth in the United States is going to be significantly, actually much more problematic than it has been the last 30 years. The people who did not actually made it will actually find it extremely difficult to actually become rich after that period. So the only solution and the only way out of it is to start buying assets today, is to start building generational wealth, is to start investing today. Because if you don't, then when that happens, when the United States will be in such a catastrophe that it's waiting, we have like what, another 4 or 5 years probably, maybe slightly more. Maybe that will happen faster because another crisis is going to hit the world. And then that is when the United States will raise taxes, cut spending, and it will be extremely difficult to buy any kind of assets at that point. So the only people who are going to win during that period, the people who are holding a lot of great assets. And the best place to actually do that is through the stock market. And if you need help to invest in the stock market, if you want to know how to actually build generational wealth through the stock market, then check out the first link in the description. Take care.